Everybody, we're going to get started. Thank you so much for joining us today for HMSC's research seminar. My name is Cinnamon Moffett, and I'm the research program manager at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center, located here in Newport, Oregon. This is a hybrid event, so we have folks in the room and we have folks online, so welcome to you all. Really appreciate having you here. Wanted to introduce a couple other folks that are going to be helping us out today. Michael Banks up front is going to be the instructor for anybody taking this for credit. So Michael can do a little wave up front. Everybody knows Michael. And we have Sana, who's sitting next to Michael, and Sana is going to help out with the online components. So I'm very happy to have both of them here helping us out. For folks online, if you have any technical issues or any questions, please put it in the chat and Sana will help you out, or let me know that you can't hear or you can't see. So just communicate with her and we'll keep this thing going. For those of you that are online, we do have your mics, cameras, and screen shares turned off, but we hope that you interact with us by putting questions into the chat, and Michael will help us read those at the end so you get your questions answered. You also, if you're online, you're able at the end to raise your digital hand, and Sana will help you figure out when to unmute and ask those questions. So please feel free to interact with our presenters today, even if you're online. For those folks that are in the room, there's more of us every week. It's very exciting to see. A couple of things: face covers are required unless you're one of the presenters. If you need something to eat or drink, please step outside and use the designated eating area for that. I'm still having to look at my notes because this is all still kind of new to us. If you haven't already, make sure you sign in. That is a requirement for OSU to have on-site things, that we have something we can do contact tracing with. And when we get to the end and we have questions, if you have questions in the room, we do need you to speak into the mic. So just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you so that nobody has to get up and be next to anybody else. But it'll be a little bit patient. We'll jump back and forth between the folks' questions online and questions in the room. And with that, any questions for me about how we're going to move forward with this hybrid event? Any questions online, Sana or Michael? Awesome. Okay, a couple of things. I wanted to let everyone know that we are recording today's event. And if you would like to watch it again, because you're so excited to see our presenters, or you want to share it with others, it will be posted on our past seminar page. And Sana's going to put that into the chat for those folks that are online. If you're curious about any of our upcoming events, it'll be on our HMSC home webpage, and you scroll to the bottom and you'll find all of our events there. Speaking of events, I wanted to promote next week's seminar. We have Dr. Cantor, who is a new professor with us with the Marine Mammal Institute, who's going to be talking about the interaction between dolphins and humans. And so that'll be a really interesting talk. We're not sure quite yet whether that will be fully remote or it'll be a hybrid event. So watch for our announcements and you'll get more detail then. All right, for today, I wanted to let everyone know this is the second part of a series that we're doing that ODF&W has put together. And I'm going to hand this off to Maggie, who's going to introduce the speakers and kind of give us a little bit of background about ODF&W and why we're doing this mini series. So Maggie.
Thanks, Cinnamon. So welcome, everybody. I am thrilled to be here in this new space. I'm Maggie Summer with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. We're a statewide agency, and our mission is to protect and enhance fish, wildlife, and habitats for use and enjoyment by present and future generations. Our Marine Resources Program, headquartered here at the Science Center and with staff in various locations up and down the coast and in inland locations, are responsible for research, monitoring, and management of marine and estuarine species and habitats. Fisheries are a big part of our work, and we wanted to share some information with the HMSC and online seminar community about how we manage fisheries for sustainability and some of the research and data needed to do it well. As Cinnamon said, this is the second in a series of 4 seminars in which we'll talk about sustainable fisheries. We began in May when Karin Braby, Leif Rasmussen, and I talked a little bit about ODFW's fisheries research, as well as management challenges related to climate and ocean change. And we're following up with 3 more that will dive into specific fisheries as case studies, starting today and continuing into next year. We hope you take away some interesting information about our fisheries and maybe some ideas that might sprout into research projects within your own labs. We're always interested in fostering and participating in collaborative efforts. Today, we have 2 speakers that I am honored to work with to learn a lot from myself and to introduce to you today. First up will be Jessica Watson, who got her master's degree from California State University, Monterey Bay in marine science and policy. For the first 5 years here with ODFW, she worked for our Marine Reserves program, spending most of her time in the field monitoring ecological indicators of performance for Oregon's 5 marine reserves. Now, instead of in the field, she can be found in meetings using the information collected by field staff when representing Oregon in regional stakeholder groups, policy councils, and commissions that make marine resource management decisions. This includes international meetings where she participates as part of the U.S. delegation on international management of highly migratory species, as well as representing Oregon interests in domestic management as a member of the Pacific Fishery Management Council's highly migratory species management team. In addition, she promotes the implementation of ecosystem-based fisheries management throughout the California current ecosystem as a member of the Pacific Fisheries Management Council's Ecosystem Working Group. Next up, we'll have Greg Krutzikowsky, who earned his bachelor's degree from Occidental College and his master's from Oregon State University, go Beavs. His work in marine science has taken him from the tropics to the Arctic. He's worked on both coasts of the US, the Hawaiian Islands, Alaska, and Australia, as well as on ships in the open ocean. He's worked as an educator, a scientist, a fisheries manager, and a boat captain. He's co-authored a number of peer-reviewed papers, as well as reports and technical memoranda. And he's been with ODFW since 2009. His current work includes the Oregon Nearshore Strategy, the marine portion of the Oregon Conservation Strategy, which features strategy species that include both forage fish and some of their predators. Greg also serves as the ODFW representative on the Coastal Pelagic Species Management Team, which is one of the other advisory bodies to the Pacific Fishery Management Council that helps shape management of coastal pelagic species fisheries. And with that, thank you all for coming and sitting with us online as well as in person, and I'll give it to Jessica.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming today, online and in person. And I'm glad you all came to get schooled and learn more about our schooling species here off the Oregon coast. I'm going to start by talking about highly migratory species, and then my colleague Greg will pick up about coastal pelagic species. So let's dive on in. First off, what is a highly migratory species? Anyway, and really, when we think about highly migratory species, these are pelagic species that live in the open water of the ocean and have very vast ranges throughout their life cycle, and usually spend maybe just a portion of that life cycle off the coast in nearshore waters. This includes species like tunas, some pelagic sharks, as well as some of the billfish like swordfish and marlin. So HMS are harvested throughout their entire range and throughout their entire life cycle. And since that's very broad and wide ranging, so are those that are harvesting them. So in the US, commercial and recreational fishers target these species as well as foreign fleets. And for most of these HMS stocks, only a small fraction of their total harvest is actually taken within US waters. To target these species, many different gear types are used throughout all the different nations that fish for them. Specifically here on the West Coast, I'm going to go through a little bit of the gears that we use. So as you can see in this map and this call out, first in the blue, you can see that there's troll gear that's used mainly to target albacore, as well as some of the other highly migratory species. That's kind of our bread and butter here off Oregon, which I'll go into in a little bit. Also, there are charter boats or some of those commercial passenger fishing vessels, as well as recreational fishing vessels that are targeting HMS using regular hook and line, as you can see here outlined in purple. Off of California, there's a large mesh drift gill net fishery that's operating, targeting HMS. And outside of the EEZ is the West Coast longline fishery that actually lands, that's based out of Hawaii and lands in California. And then in yellow, you can see there are also some of these small scale kind of artisanal fisheries, and this includes harpoon, as well as the soon to be authorized deep set buoy gear. So since HMS stocks move throughout these large areas of the Pacific and are fished by many different nations, using different gear types, management by the US alone is not enough to really ensure the sustainable harvest. Therefore, there are international treaties that the US is part of with regards to the conservation and management of HMS. In the Pacific, the treaties establishing these regional fisheries management organizations, or RFMOs, really fall into two main groups. What you can see here in green is the IATTC, which is the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission, and is kind of in charge of the Eastern Pacific. And then in purple, you can see the Western and Central Pacific Ocean Fisheries Commission, or the WCPFC. And the treaties establishing these RFMOs give them wide scope to manage and conserve HMS and other organisms caught in the HMS fisheries. This includes also creating resolutions and management measures for non-target species of HMS, like some of the other pelagic sharks, as well as resolutions with regards to non-fish, like marine mammals, sea turtles, and birds, electronic monitoring resolutions, as well as observer at sea safety measures. And member nations of these international groups and treaties, including the US, as well as many other nations, are obligated to implement those agreed upon conservation and management measures for their national fisheries, with the goal of being responsible for the conservation of HMS throughout the Pacific. And besides just bringing together all of these nations to come up with these management measures, this is also the arena in which highly migratory species stock assessments occur. And those occur through international scientific committees that are composed of multiple scientists from different countries, bringing regional data sets together to try and come up with stock assessments for the entire range of some of these species. In addition, there are also other international treaties here on the West Coast, one being the US, Canada, and Albacore Treaty that was established in 1981. And this treaty gives not only fishing, but port privileges to the two countries. So it really is saying how many Canadian vessels can come fish and land in the West Coast and vice versa. And that treaty is actually looked at and renegotiated every 3 years. And these other RFMOs meet annually to discuss priorities and come up with new resolutions and conservation measures. So like I said, part of this whole process is that the nations that are involved in these treaties have to implement these measures domestically. And that is done through the regional fisheries management councils that were established under Magnuson-Stevens Act. So here on the West Coast, that is the Fisheries Pacific, or the Pacific Fisheries Management Council, which I will probably refer to the council for the rest of the talk, just so I don't mess up on all of the acronyms in alphabet soup. So the council manages multiple fisheries, not just HMS, and really it is managing the fisheries that are occurring off the West Coast EEZ. This includes fisheries for salmon, groundfish, coastal pelagic species, as well as HMS. And in addition, there's also another fisheries management plan under the council's purview that kind of acts as an umbrella across all the different FMPs, or fisheries management plans for these different fisheries. And that's the ecosystem fishery management plan. And it's looking at the interactions between different species of these groups that are in these different fisheries, as well as applying ecosystem-based approaches to fisheries management. So it's kind of going in between all these other separate fisheries. And really, council meetings look something like this when you go in person. They're a little bit different now that we're online, but these boxes of these faces will all appear. But really, council meetings contain the Pacific Fisheries Management Council's appointed council members. So there is a select amount of appointed members who are the voting membership of the council. In addition, there's council advisory bodies and council staff. And the point of these meetings is really they're kind of like the heart of the federal fisheries management process, where ideas develop into management decisions and recommendations and then are forwarded onto the National Marine Fisheries Service for implementation. And a really important part of this is for the council to have, to hear from not only members of the public, but also advisory teams that represent a broad spectrum of perspectives and views. And so moving into the different bodies that make up the advisory bodies, there's kind of a whole slew of different groups. There's technical teams, advisory subpanels, committees, and working groups. And all of these groups really are trying to provide information and recommendations for the council to consider when making some of these hard decisions. And most are balanced in the sense that there is usually one team that's a little bit more technical and state appointed, as well as a team that is made up of more stakeholder inputs. So in the case of HMS, there are two teams. So for the highly migratory species management team, it's mainly made up of biologists, ecologists, and economists from not only state agencies like ODFW, that's the seat that I represent, but the other states of California, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. There's also tribes that are represented on this team, as well as some of the Fisheries Science Center scientists. And these appointments are reviewed by council, and then we go ahead and review and track information and provide recommendations to council on management decisions. Our counterparts in this whole process is the Highly Migratory Species Advisory Subpanel. And the subpanel is made up of the fishing industry, so commercial and recreational fishing industry members, as well as processors, as well as non-governmental organizations, conservation groups, tribes. And really what they're doing is doing the same thing as the technical team or the management team in providing input on how different management measures will impact the fishing communities and conservation efforts. And so all of this information is then synthesized in a meeting, presented for council, and therefore then management decisions are made. So I've been talking about fisheries management plans and what am I meaning when I'm saying that? So for each one of those 4 fisheries, there is a fishery management plan that kind of outlines that fishery. This management plan for HMS really provides the mechanism for the US to meet its responsibilities under some of these international treaties, as well as national standards, specifically for HMS. It also applies to all the US vessels for the management unit fishing for those management unit species on the high seas as well. So not just inside the EEZ, but those fishing outside our EEZ that want to land here on the West Coast, so in California, Washington, or Oregon. And the FMP is really intended to facilitate council engagement with the RFMOs and meet some of these international obligations, as well as meet some of our own domestic policies like Magnuson-Stevenson's Act, and really also to provide collaboration and coordination between regional fisheries management organizations and councils like the Western Pacific Fisheries Management Council, which is based in Alaska, as well as facilitate some international or some agreements with tribal nations. So I mentioned this idea of management unit species that are included under the fisheries management plan. And really what it comes down to is within this FMP, or this fisheries management plan for highly migratory species, and with all the other fisheries, there's a couple of different groupings in which species fall into that a fishery can target or not be targeting, but encounter. This includes management unit species. So those are the stocks that the fishery is actively targeting. In the case here off of Oregon, that would be Albacore. There's also ecosystem component species. So these are species that we're tracking so that we can start looking at indicators of how the ecosystem's doing, how interactions are moving forward inside the fishery. So they're kind of species of interest. There's prohibited species, so species that cannot be retained within the fishery for HMS. That is white sharks, basking sharks, megamouth sharks, those types of things. And then there's also species of bycatch concern. And within HMS, this includes sea turtles, marine mammals, and seabirds. So here on Oregon, like I said, our bread and butter when it comes to HMS is North Pacific albacore tuna. So as a state, we're constantly monitoring our local fisheries. And let's just learn a little bit about our lovely albacore tuna. So the young tuna that are found offshore here in Oregon are relatively young in age, so 3 to 5 years old. They weigh between 12 and 30 pounds and usually start showing up off our coast late June. And fishers will actually have to travel 30 or more miles offshore to actually target this fish. That's because it really loves that warm, clear blue water that's 62 degrees or above. And while they're out there, usually in July and August is when we see our highest catches, but albacore remain off our coast until October. The commercial harvest for albacore started in 1929 when the fishery migrated north from the Southern California Bight. And it's one of the few open access fisheries, meaning that we do not limit the number of permits or licenses to catch and land albacore. With regards to recreational harvest, it's also a very popular one. Recreational anglers have to have, all of the capabilities in their vessel to make it to these, distant waters. So 30 miles offshore can be pretty hard in a smaller vessel, so they have to have skills. But when they do, they have a daily bag limit of 25 fish per day. And the fishery for recreational really started to gain in popularity in the 2000s. So at MRP, the Marine Resources Program here at ODFW, fishery monitoring and sampling are really critical to managing impacts on marine species to ensure that long-term sustainability and continued fishing opportunities for current and future generations. And because of that, and why we think monitoring is so important, is because we need to have the information present so that we can make sure that we're meeting that mandate. And when it comes to fisheries monitoring, we have several programs. With regards to the albacore fishery, there are kind of two separate ones. We have one for commercial and one for recreational. For the commercial monitoring, this is a collaboration that is done between ODFW, the National Marine Fisheries Service Southwest Fisheries Science Center, and Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission. And our samplers are out there collecting information on logbooks and e-tickets and things like that, as well as biological data, so size of fish, and sampling at several ports during the summer months when the albacore season is operating. We also have recreational samplers, which you can see at the docks, so our portside samplers. They are part of our ORBS program, or our Oregon Recreational Boat Survey. And ORBS kind of altered their survey starting in the 2000s once recreational anglers really started to start targeting albacore. And they're collecting information on effort, catch, as well as biological information as well on size. And all of this information is included in our annual albacore report that comes out yearly. It'll probably come out early next year for 2021. We're crunching numbers. And it also has an accompanying newsletter that is a little bit more graphical in case you just want the quick overview of what's happening in the fishery for that year. And all of this information is really important because not only does it feed into state management, it then feeds up into the Pacific Council's regional management of how the fishery is doing in Oregon compared to the other states. And then this information is also fed into the stock assessment at that international level. So looking at 2020, how did our commercial fishing industry, fishing season go? Well, as you can see, 45% of the pounds landed were coming out of Depot Bay and Newport, followed by Charleston with 32. There were 207 commercial vessels that conducted 597 fishing trips, landing 4.4 million pounds of tuna, and for an ex-vessel value of 7 million. Now, one thing we also track through time is those total pounds and ex-vessel values, as you can see here in the bottom. And what you can see is that through time, it does fluctuate, but what we have been seeing over the past 5 years is kind of a decline with a little bit of a bump. So looking at the recreational fishing effort for 2020, you can see again for total catch, 30% came out of Depot Bay or Newport, with 32% coming out of Gold Beach or Brookings. There were 807 boat trips where 5,357 fish were landed for an average of 2 fish per angler trip. And if you look down here at the graph, you can see on the x-axis is year, on the y is estimated angler trips and catch in thousands. And we're looking at effort, catch, and CPUE. And you can see that there's this huge decline from 2019 to 2020, but that's because 2019 broke all the records for recreational catch. They caught over 100,000 fish. It was about 6 fish per angler trip. It was a banner year, So with all of this information going into our monitoring for this, the HMS Albacore fishery here in Oregon, overall, in general, HMS management is really challenging. This is due to many factors. One being there's numerous species. There is moderate information for the species, for certain species of tuna, but that just gets less and less as you go into the different groupings for like pelagic sharks as well as billfish. This knowledge is really limited because we only interact with this species for a portion of its life stage. There is a lot of limited knowledge on how the rest of the life stage is moving forward. And part of this is due to the fact that HMS are harvested by numerous coastal distant fishing nations. So bringing all that information together can be difficult. And so this is kind of my first call to order to all of you in person and online, that if you see your science being able to inform and fill some of these knowledge gaps, please reach out. We're always willing to collaborate and to discuss so that we can make sure we're bringing the best available science, not only to our state, but regional and international management for these species. And I have to say, I think Oregon's doing a pretty good job as of right now. So you can see here that Dr. Kathleen O'Malley's State Fisheries Genomics Lab has really pushed forward the knowledge on the stock structure for South Pacific and North Pacific albacore. And what's really interesting about this project is that it was a great example of a collaboration between the fishing industry and science. So the fishing industry had a lot of questions and concerns about which population was actually being harvested off the West Coast. Was it South Pacific or North Pacific albacore? And through genetic sampling, we're able to determine, or the genomics lab was able to determine those percentages. And so really this is a great way in which science and industry are coming together to answer some of these important questions to inform management, both at our regional level, but also at the international level as well. And this talk was presented here in the past and can be found online. I highly recommend it. Another way in which Oregon data is being used to fill some of these information gaps is through the Future Seas project, which is a collaboration of interdisciplinary scientists, ecologists, and economists through NIMS. And this is funded through the climate program at NOAA. And what they're working on here is looking at how climate change is going to impact West Coast fisheries, specifically focusing on albacore tuna, swordfish, and coastal pelagic species. So this paper just came out last year, and this is by Tim Frawley. And what he was really looking at was kind of how the change of the structure and function of the albacore fishery has happened in the Pacific Northwest. So how the distribution of the species has changed, how size of fishing vessels have been targeting these different, have been targeting albacore through time. And in figure 8 of this paper, I think it's a really interesting analysis that the authors did, where they kind of use this network analysis to look at fishing portfolios of coastal areas and seeing the impact of the different fisheries. And so as you can see through time, albacore here in blue is pretty small in the beginning and then becomes a really important factor. This is really important as we start to think about changing climates, changing distributions and abundances throughout the California current. So as these species are, changing based on their physical environment, this is also going to be impacting our coastal communities. And so this information can help not only at the state but regional level develop some management measures so we can start to prepare for these different climate change scenarios in the future. Another project that came out of the Future Seas dealt with kind of the interaction between different groups in these fisheries management plans. So the habitat use of albacore, the predator albacore, with the coastal pelagic species of their forage fish, and how they were prey switching, and how that might change given changing climates and ocean conditions and distributions. So this is kind of, again, looking at those linkages, not only looking at fisheries in their silos, but now combining them and looking at how they're interacting with each other. And this is Muelling et al. And I just want to say again, any way in which you see your science can help us make more sustainable management decisions, we're all for it. So please reach out. And now that I've mentioned coastal pelagics, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Greg.
Thank you, Jessica. That's what a great introduction and segue into as we continue our schooling 101 with the management, a look at the management of coastal pelagic species in Oregon. And these species are a critical link in the ecosystem, as you will soon see. So this is a slide that I borrowed from Maggie's presentation, and it talks about the policy and management and how it's done in Oregon. There's the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission that manages fisheries in Oregon waters from the shore out to 3 nautical miles, but also the fish that are caught outside of that and landed into Oregon. The Pacific Fisheries Management Council, which Jessica has told you all about already, and its advisory bodies, which make recommendations on rules, regulations, and management of fisheries from 3 to 200 nautical miles in our exclusive economic zone. And of course, there's joint management when the fisheries overlap. And all of these policies are shaped by both state and federal management laws and policies that really talk about conservation, economics, ecology, and social for the benefit of present and future generations. And that all adds up to making sure these fisheries are sustainable. So what are coastal pelagic species? Well, these guys are they're usually generally small fishes, although jack mackerel and Pacific mackerel get a little bit larger. And it's a diverse group, and they eat low on the food chain, and they're a critical link in providing food to higher order consumers up the food web. So you've got Pacific sardine, northern anchovy, and I'll read off the ones that are management unit species in the federal plan first. Pacific mackerel, jack mackerel, which are 4 different fish families. And then you have both a couple of invertebrates, market squid, which of course are mollusks, and krill, the arthropods. And it's interesting that krill are a management unit species, but they're prohibited from harvest. They were actually added to the coastal pelagic species federal management plan through one of its amendments, Amendment 12, specifically to prohibit harvest of this really important critical link in the ecosystem. There are a couple of other species that are in the state, under the state CPS regulations and rules, and also they're included as ecosystem component species in the federal plan as well. Pacific herring, there is fishery in Oregon, and there are fisheries allowed in Oregon waters for Pacific herring. And the smelts are also ecosystem component species in the federal CPS FMP. But their harvest is actually prohibited in Oregon ocean waters. And most of these species, I should say, there really is very little recreational catch of them. Sure, some people catch herring for, to use for bait when they go salmon fishing and things like that. But the vast majority of the fishing for these species is commercial in nature here in Oregon and in most of the West Coast. One of the challenges for managing fisheries for these species in a sustainable manner is the fact that they are widely known for their just amazing fluctuations of boom and bust cycles that have gone on for, well, here we've got evidence for, 1700 years, from about 300 to the late 1990s. And this is from a paper from Tim Baumgartner. They actually looked at the bottom sediments in the anoxic basin of the Santa Barbara Basin. And they did this for both sardine and anchovy, which are two of the species that make up the vast bulk of these CPS that are in the California current ecosystem. And you can see that they've gone through these boom and bust cycles, orders of magnitude, or an order of magnitude in terms of biomass in millions of metric tons, long before there were ever any commercial fisheries for these stocks. So that presents a big challenge. And the thought is that this is environmentally driven, and yet the mechanisms are poorly understood even today. So another challenge is that these are all transboundary stocks, and Jessica has told you so much about the transboundary agreements or the international agreements that go into, the highly migratory species, but that's not the case for these CPS species. All of these stocks are transboundary stocks. Their range includes both Canadian waters, US waters, and the waters off Mexico. And fisheries can occur in all three countries. There are no international management agreements, so they're managed independently in each country, which presents challenges for sustainable fisheries management. You can only do so much with one country setting regulations. However, there is a long-standing trinational forum for sardine and small pelagics, and it started in 2000. And I got a couple of pictures here from the last one that we had in person, which was down at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center in La Jolla, California. But they've also been hosted up in Canada on Vancouver Island and down in Baja, in La Paz and Ensenada. And this has gone a long way in helping managers, scientists, and fishermen share information to make sustainable fisheries management decisions and sharing of those data. So what are CPS fisheries and how are they actually, how do they occur? It's primarily with purse seine gear or something like purse seine gear. Some are Lampera nets, but most of them are these big seine nets that the small boat that you can see, let's see if I can get my cursor. Oh yeah, he's got a little boat. Then that actually hauls this big net out in a big circle. And then it is brought in and pursed up at the bottom with either at the lead line or just above the lead line with what's called a rib line, and then hauled in close to the boat. And then they take a big vacuum, essentially, suction, and they pump the fish back up through this tube and onto the boat, and then it goes down into the hold. And that's the way that these fisheries are prosecuted. So what are the components of CPS management? Well, they're really very much like the components of any other type of fisheries management. Communication with stakeholders. Jessica's told you a lot about the communication that goes on at the Pacific Fishery Management Council, but it also goes on at the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission as well. Scientific surveys and sampling of the species that are out there play into it. Monitoring and sampling the catch. Logbooks are a component of it. Stock assessments for some species is definitely a huge component. Again, communication with stakeholders, and then of course implementing those management tools. And those can include such things as catch controls like harvest guidelines, annual catch limits. there can be seasonal and spatial structure to managing the fishery, and permits and licenses, such as limited entry is one example. And all of those are, to some degree, have been incorporated into CPS management. And again, communication with the stakeholders, letting people know what's going on and making sure that that information is available. A little bit about scientific surveys. Now, these are some pictures that were provided to me by my colleagues at NOAA Fisheries, or National Marine Fisheries Service. And the big coastwide survey that has been become an integral part of CPS management is called an acoustic trawl survey. And you can see over on the far right here, let's see, where's my, I don't know where my mouse went. Oh, there it is. You can see that these are the survey lines that were all the way done all the way up and down the coast there. It's done essentially with a downward looking echo sounder, and you get all of these echoes back, but you don't really know what species they are until you actually go back, and they do this at night. They go back and they do trawls, then they bring up the fish, they sample those fish to determine what the species are and the size of those fish. And that provides an information on what species are out there, how many there are. They can come up with biomass estimates in certain locations and see how things change up and down the coast. They typically do this survey in the summer months, but they can't get in with those big NOAA ships close to shore. So what they do is they've used such things as these sail drones that you see in the foreground here to try and sample in close to shore in some locations. And they've also, industry has become a huge partner now in getting these surveys done and sampling in the nearshore waters. And they use a similar echo sounder that they borrow from the folks at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center, and they do those in very close to shore. They're also starting to do a little bit of aerial survey stuff in California in the nearshore waters as well. And all of that information is closely coordinated and that. So on a smaller scale here in Yaquina Bay, we've used an echo sounder to look at the Yaquina Bay roe herring fishery, which is an entirely state managed fishery. And here you see my colleague Troy Buell on our small 24-foot boat, much smaller scale. Here you see down below Troy's picture, you've got the picture of the results of a single day, and you can see out in red the areas where most of the fish were located. You see a couple of pictures of the echo sounder display on board the boat and on board a computer afterwards. We do a little bit of sampling to make sure that indeed the fish that we're seeing are herring, and we jig those with a hook and line. And then we do some sampling of the fish to see how mature they are, if they're getting close to spawning. And the spawning itself is tremendous to see in Yaquina Bay. It's really an amazing thing to see, especially when there's a lot of sea lions and birds going after the spawning herring. But the over on the far, my right-hand side, I guess it's your right-hand side too, are some pictures of the spawn that is laid, the eggs that are adhere to the rocks and to pilings and to rock and algae that's all over the bay. We also do some biological sampling, and this is the fishery dependent. You know, all of that scientific sampling is fishery independent work, right? This is the fishery dependent stuff. We collect samples, as Jessica has mentioned, with going out and sampling that's brought into the dock, and get things like lengths and weights. Here's some data from the squid fishery. And even back in 1984, we were sampling when it was going on, 84, 85, after that first big El Nino, that fishery really sort of started then. In more recent years, you know, from 2016 through even this year, there's still quite a bit of squid fishing going on. In fact, quite a bit more these days. But you can see that the size of the animals hasn't really changed all that much. You know, a little bit of difference in the ranges and the slightly skewed sex ratio on those that are being caught. Other examples, the sardine fishery occurred here in Oregon. It really started in 1928. It went through the mid part of the century. And then there was a long hiatus until about 1999. It started up again and lasted until 2015. And here's some examples of the age, the weight, the length of the sardine that were landed in that fishery, and also information about the maturity in one particular year there. And all of these types of data go into stock assessments to get an idea of how many fish are out there, which are modeled to look at the stock and how it changes over time. Another component is getting logbook data. One of the things that we can't really tell very easily in any other way is where the fishermen are actually fishing, where they're doing their fishing and collecting the species. And here you see some logbook data that's plotted from 2016 to the present. The squid, of course, are in that bright orange color. There's also the marine protected areas, the marine reserves, and the seabird protection area that are also on this these maps. The seabird protection area is an area that was always allowed for squid fishing, even today. And that is because when it was negotiated, it was known that this was an important area for that fishery, and the squid fishermen wanted to make sure that they would be able to continue to fish there. You can see that the fishing mostly occurred in that area in 2016 and and down off of Charleston area as well. You can see that it's spread a little bit further in 2019, a little bit north of there, and as far up as Pacific City in 2020. So that's another type of data that we get. We also monitor, this is an example of data that was collected during the sardine fishery. And you can see that there's the coastward harvest guideline that's there over in one column, the adjusted harvest guidelines. Some little portions were taken out for exempted fishing permits and things like that. And in the early years, there was a spatial component to it as well, right? The northern allocation. That has since gone away into a time period allocation. And you see here information about how many permits were issued in Oregon, how many vessels actually targeted sardine in Oregon, the number of landings each year, and the amount that was landed here in Oregon. And that goes to our fish ticket database sort of thing. The dates that they were first landed and last landed, and the number of buyers, as well as the economic thing. These are all important components of a fishery. And the percentage that was actually taken in Oregon state waters versus in federal waters. And that, again, comes from logbook data that can't be gotten other ways. The other thing that goes into looking at whether or not a fishery is sustainable is bycatch. And here I've got a table of various species that were components of the bycatch, things that were not sold is the definition for bycatch. Either they couldn't be sold economically or for regulatory reasons. And bycatch in CPS fisheries is generally a pretty low component of the total that is caught. It's usually less than 1%. And we know that that was the case for the sardine fishery as well. We've had observers in California, Washington, and Oregon that have verified that. And this particular table has a list of the species. And a lot of times the species that are caught that are not the target species are other coastal pelagic species as well. And you can see that in 2016, the biggest component was northern anchovy right up here. And there were even some market squid that couldn't be sold for various reasons. But again, you know, you look at the totals and the total bycatch, and it really is a fairly small component of the CPS fisheries. Providing information to the public is an important part. And we put out, here's an example of some of the sardine reports that are available on the Marine Resources Program webpage and our publications page. But every year, there's also on the federal side of things, this stock assessment and fishery evaluation document, or a SAFE document, as they call it, SAFE. And those are put out annually, and it provides information on total catch, bycatch, economics, and things that are going on with the fishery. And it's a great source of information. Jessica mentioned fishery science, and it's interesting because sardine and the quote unquote problem with the sardine fishery may have actually been the beginnings of ecosystem-based science. People started looking at it, and there has now, it actually gave way to or created what has become the Cal Coffee program, which has now gone on for over 70 years and has looked at what's going on out in the ocean and how it affects fisheries. These days, we have this California Current Integrated Ecosystem Assessment, which is now been incorporated and presented to the Pacific Fishery Management Council on a yearly basis, looking at what's going on in the California current. And with the coastal pelagic species component there is still really a bit of a work in progress. And, you know, looking at the environmental drivers, there's still a lot not known about the actual mechanisms. I've picked 3 papers here that recently came out, a couple of out of the Future Seas thing that talk about the projected shifts in the 21st century sardine fishery and catch in the California current, and the potential impact of that shifting sardine distribution in West Coast landings. And it looks like if and when the sardine stock recovers again, that Oregon might gather a bit more of those sardine when the fishery starts up again. And an interesting paper that suggests that ecosystem-based management might contribute to transboundary cooperation. And they specifically looked at the case of Pacific sardine. So to finish up, just a couple of things that have been recently prioritized by the Council for CPS management. On sardine side, stock definition. There are actually 3 stocks of sardine along our west coast, 2 of them in the Pacific, one up in the Gulf of California or Sea of Cortez, as it's called. And those 2 stocks, one is centered down off of Baja and the other one here in US waters, but the 2 move north and south at the, sort of at the same time, but there's interaction and they overlap in Southern California. And, so looking at that, and genetically, they haven't been found to be any different. So we really need to do some work on that stock definition and assignment. They're currently being assigned based on the temperature of the water, and some research has been done along that way. The environmental harvest control rule for Pacific sardine is fairly unique among fishery managers and management plans. And it's based on a correlation of sea surface temperature. It was originally, the Scripps temperature, the temperature at Scripps Pier, because that was an easy data point that they had. It's now the Cal Coffee data that's collected. But that correlation, like many correlations over time, when you add more data to it, sometimes they break down. And that seems to be the case with this one. So we need to look at that again. Northern anchovy, it hasn't been, there are a couple of different stocks, one up here off of Oregon and into Canadian waters. we are getting information about that one, through the surveys, but it hasn't ever really had a true stock assessment, a modeled stock assessment. In California, the central subpopulation of northern anchovy hasn't had an assessment since the mid-90s. It's due for one before the end of this year. And they're constantly working on ways to improve those surveys. And again, as Jessica has suggested, we would love to hear about ways and research that folks here are doing that can help us with that. So with that, we would be delighted to take any questions and for either of us and our emails. If you can't get, you can always email us. Okay, thank you.
All right, so we have the first one.
So this, in relation to sardines, can you describe?
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about that. Certainly temperature has been the proxy that has been used for that. Some folks have thought that the Pacific Decadal Oscillation may be a good indication over time, and perhaps maybe better than just the Cal-Coffee temperature stuff or the temperature at Scripps Pier, which has been shown to have changed quite widely from the overall temperature in the California current system. So yeah, but the mechanisms, those are the ones that really, having those correlations is one thing, but understanding the mechanisms is really not well understood at all.
Great. I'm going to do a little mic. Can we test, test, test?
I'm still on. Yes, I can.
All right, everybody, we're going to keep working on this. Does that sound better? Okay, so we got a question in the room. I'm coming up to Dawn. Hang on just a second.
Is it on? Yeah. Thanks for great talks from both of you. That was really interesting to hear. I was curious, Jessica, you said that 2019 was a banner year for Albacore. Oh, did it go out again? Wondering if you have thoughts on why did it have to do with fishery effort? And I think you said it was just in the recreational fleet, right? Or was the warm tuna water more accessible? Or what are your thoughts on that?
My mic now? All right. Yeah, so thanks for that question, Don. So the tuna were actually closer to shore. So it was there was easier access for the recreational fleet to get out there because the warm water had pushed them inshore. So that's why there was kind of this banner year. And they were also there during time periods where the weather was cooperating. So that kind of is the other component of commercial and recreational fisheries and what determines those catch rates. Commercial guys are usually pretty far offshore. They're dealing with really tough weather conditions. And so it's tough to get out there sometimes and to stay out there. And then when there are those open weather windows, the recreational fleet can really take advantage as the warm water pushes the schools of Albacore closer to shore.
Okay, we're going to take one more question and then we'll do a little pause. And since we're having trouble with the mic, if you have questions, we'll come up and ask if you're in the room. And if you're online, we'll ask them directly to the presenters. So last question goes to Michael.
Thank you. So this question is from Lori Whitekamp. Jessica, you mentioned that Albacore Court of Oregon are 3 to 5 years old. How old do they get when they become reproductive? How old do they get and when do they become reproductive?
All right, that's a great question. I do not know that off the top of my head at this moment. I can get back to you and post that. But yeah, I believe it's, yeah, I'm not going to guess because I don't want to be completely wrong on that.
And with that, we're going to go ahead and thank our presenters. Again, if you have questions, come on up and ask them. And if you're online and you have questions, hang in there. We'll get to you in just a second. All right, everybody, thank you so much.